On the evening of 15th of June, 1998, under a quiet winter sky at the maximum security facility of Paramoremo Prison in Auckland, 4 inmates scaled an exterior wall, cut through perimeter fencing, and disappeared into the surrounding darkness. Among them was Graeme Burton, convicted of murder 5 years earlier for the stabbing death of a lighting technician at a Wellington nightclub. Security logs recorded the breach at approximately 21:47. Within 48 hours, his photograph appeared on every police bulletin across the country. Armed response units deployed across the Coromandel Peninsula, roadblocks materialized on rural highways, and a nationwide manhunt commenced. That flight from the prison walls marked the first time New Zealand's enforcement apparatus confronted the scale of risk posed by an escaping lifer with documented violent tendencies. It raised fundamental questions that would echo for years. How had a convicted murderer been able to slip away, and what would happen if he returned to violence? On the night of 21st November 1992, at a Wellington nightclub known as the Car Park, a lighting technician named Paul Anderson was completing his shift. According to court records filed in the Wellington District Court, at approximately 23:45, security personnel intervened when an intoxicated patron became disruptive near the main bar. Witness statements and security footage corroborated what followed. The man, later identified as 21-year-old Graeme Burton, had been asked to leave after aggressive behavior. Instead, he approached Anderson near the venue's stairwell landing and asked whether he worked at the establishment. Without waiting for a response, Burton drew a knife and stabbed him. Anderson collapsed against the railing, bleeding heavily from wounds to his chest. Paramedics arriving within minutes were unable to revive him. The arrest followed before dawn. In sentencing proceedings, Justice Heron noted the senselessness of the attack. A young man killed for simply being present. Burton received a mandatory life sentence for murder. The court record documented what would become relevant years later. The perpetrator had been under the influence of multiple substances at the time of the killing. The conviction marked the beginning of a long incarceration, but for Anderson's family, it would never bring closure. During his imprisonment from 1992 to 2006, institutional records documented a pattern that corrections psychologists found troubling. Burton failed numerous drug tests, primarily for benzodiazepines and other controlled substances. Psychological assessments contracted by the Department of Corrections flagged him as high risk, citing both violent tendencies and unresolved drug dependency. His early disciplinary history included assaults on other inmates and threats against staff, including an alleged plot to harm a corrections officer that remained formally unsubstantiated due to insufficient evidence. Internal reports noted his intelligence and capacity for manipulation, yet by the mid-2000s, under the scrutiny of parole review hearings, something appeared to shift. A psychological evaluation conducted in late 2005 described his institutional conduct over the prior 24 months as impeccable. He had completed anger management programs, maintained employment within the prison workshop, and avoided disciplinary infractions. The assessment recommended consideration for supervised release, noting his apparent rehabilitation. Some corrections staff expressed private reservations about the transformation's authenticity, pointing to his history of strategic compliance before review hearings. These objections did not make it into the formal parole recommendation. The institutional record documented both clear risk markers and reported behavioral improvement. This assessment would pave the way for a conditional release under supervision. The 1998 escape had already demonstrated Burton's capacity for calculated action. On 15th June of that year, he and 3 other inmates exploited maintenance lapses in Paramoremo's perimeter security, The prison's after-action report, released months later, documented failures in fence maintenance and patrol scheduling that had created the window for escape. A nationwide alert triggered the deployment of more than 100 police officers across multiple regions. Intelligence reports traced suspicious property burglaries through coastal holiday towns on the Coromandel Peninsula. In one abandoned holiday home, investigators discovered evidence of forced entry alongside discarded shotgun shells and drug paraphernalia. For 10 days, Burton remained at large, moving through rural areas and avoiding detection. On 28 June 1998, armed police located him and 2 other escapees hiding inside a luxury holiday property in Tairua. All 3 surrendered without resistance. Burton received additional years on his sentence for the escape and associated burglaries. The incident exposed systemic security weaknesses at the maximum security facility, prompting reviews of perimeter protocols and staffing levels. More significantly for Burton's future, the escape and recapture became part of his permanent parole review file, a documented instance of his willingness to circumvent institutional constraints when opportunity arose. After serving 14 years, including time added for his escape, Burton became eligible for parole consideration. Between 2004 and 2006, the New Zealand Parole Board reviewed his case in multiple hearings. Documentation from these proceedings shows that 6 separate psychological reports were submitted, most recommending continued drug and alcohol treatment as a condition of any release, citing significant relapse risk. The reports noted his history of substance-fueled violence and questioned whether institutional sobriety would translate to community settings. Nonetheless, the board's deliberations weighed his recent institutional record heavily. On 28 June 2006, exactly 8 years after his recapture following the prison escape, the board concluded that a carefully managed release under close supervision was justified. The decision cited his impeccable recent behavior and completion of rehabilitation programs. The approved release plan required Burton to reside with his biological mother at a fixed address in Wellington. Strict conditions included regular reporting to a probation officer, restricted movement outside designated areas, and prohibitions on alcohol and drug use. The plan appeared comprehensive on paper. What it lacked, as subsequent reviews would reveal, was robust mechanisms for immediate recall based on intelligence suggesting criminal association as opposed to formal charges or documented conviction. By November 2006, warning signs had begun accumulating. Intelligence from police informants indicated that Burton was frequenting known drug dealers in the Wellington area, suspected of purchasing methamphetamine and associating with another recently paroled murderer. Reports placed them together at nightclubs and establishments explicitly prohibited under his parole conditions. Probation officers documented these reports and escalated their concerns through official channels. On 30 November 2006, community probation staff prepared affidavits to support a parole board recall application. However, police declined to provide supporting statements, citing operational concerns about revealing informant identities in formal proceedings. The recall application stalled. Meanwhile, additional intelligence suggested Burton had moved out of his mother's flat, the designated parole residence, representing another clear breach of conditions. The address listed in his supervision file was no longer accurate. Probation officers noted the discrepancy, but lacked enforcement authority without police cooperation. The gap between institutional concern and enforcement action widened. Internal correspondence from this period shows frustration among supervision staff who recognized the escalating risk but found themselves constrained by procedural requirements that demanded more than intelligence assessments to trigger recall. The warning signs existed in the system. They simply could not be acted upon quickly enough. On 22 December 2006, community probation finally secured a warrant from Wellington District Court for Burton's arrest on grounds of breaching parole conditions. A second interim recall order followed from the Parole Board on 29 December 2006, formally ordering his return to prison. The legal authority to detain Burton now existed. However, administrative processing failures created a critical gap. Internal police logs reveal that the first warrant was not entered into the National Intelligence Application Database until 4 January 2007, nearly 2 weeks after issuance. The Parole Board's faxed recall order similarly went unlogged due to a shift change oversight during the holiday period. For those 2 weeks, despite valid legal authority for his arrest, Burton remained effectively invisible to frontline officers conducting routine checks. A traffic stop, a welfare inquiry, any standard police interaction would not have flagged him as a wanted person. The administrative delay meant the system had authorized his detention, but failed to communicate that authorization to those who might encounter him. Burton, aware or not of the warrants, continued moving freely through the Wellington region. On 3 January 2007, Burton and an associate committed an armed assault in Wellington, a fact recorded in police incident logs filed that evening. The victim reported being attacked by 2 men, one wielding a firearm. That assault triggered renewed urgency within police intelligence units. The warrant became active in operational briefings, and investigators began compiling a comprehensive dossier on Burton's movements, associations, and potential locations. Over the next 48 hours, surveillance operations intensified. Informant interviews suggested he had acquired weapons and expressed violent intentions. On 5 January 2007, police issued a second warrant specifically for arrest and detention. Intelligence assessments now classified Burton as armed and dangerous. Yet despite this escalation, investigators lacked sufficient real-time intelligence to predict exactly when or where he might strike. The legal instruments were finally in place, but the window for prevention was closing. Somewhere in the Wellington region, a convicted murderer with documented violent tendencies was moving toward an outcome that the system had foreseen but failed to prevent. The situation as of 5 January 2007 represented a convergence of institutional failures. A high-risk parolee had been released despite multiple psychological warnings. Intelligence about his parole violations had not triggered timely recall. Administrative delays had rendered valid arrest warrants operationally invisible. An armed assault had occurred without immediate apprehension. Police now understood the threat, but couldn't locate the subject. The investigative apparatus was fully engaged, too late to prevent what would follow, but positioned to respond. What had begun as a parole supervision case had transformed into an active manhunt for an armed offender with nothing left to lose. On 6 January 2007, at approximately 17 to Sast, an associate dropped Burton off near a firebreak track between Lower Hutt and Wainuiomata in the hills southeast of Wellington. Police records reconstructed from witness statements and forensic evidence show he was heavily armed: a sawn-off pump-action shotgun, a revolver, a large hunting knife, a folding knife, and an extendable baton. At approximately 17:05, Burton encountered Karl Kuchenbecker riding a quad bike along the track. Forensic reports indicate Burton shot Kuchenbecker 3 times at close range and then stabbed him, puncturing his right lung. The autopsy confirmed cause of death as the shotgun wounds. Kuchenbecker, a recreational rider enjoying the summer afternoon, had no connection to Burton and no warning of what approached. Minutes later, Burton continued along the track and encountered a group of mountain bikers. Jeremy Simpson, Carl Holmes, and Kate Rare were all struck by shotgun fire as they attempted to flee. Simpson and Holmes sustained serious wounds. Rhea, despite her injuries, managed to reach a road and flag down a passing motorist. Police radio logs record the first emergency call arriving at 17:30. Dispatch immediately alerted units in the area. When uniformed officers arrived at the firebreak exit on Summit Road at 17:47, operational briefings had already connected the reports to Burton. They established a cordon and called for armed backup, aware they might be confronting a fugitive with demonstrated capacity for lethal violence. As the two officers retrieved rifles from their patrol vehicle, Burton emerged from the firebreak carrying his shotgun. According to statements provided to the Independent Police Conduct Authority, he raised the weapon toward Officer B. Officer A shouted the standard challenge, "Armed police." Burton did not comply. The officers initially retreated to cover behind their vehicle, maintaining sight lines while awaiting backup. When Burton continued advancing, they repositioned and attempted verbal commands to surrender. He responded by pointing his shotgun at Officer A. 3 shots were fired by police. One round struck Burton in the upper right thigh, severing his femoral artery and incapacitating him. Officers immediately moved to secure the suspect, applying first aid to control bleeding while restraining him. Burton continued to resist verbally, but was physically subdued. Medical evacuation transported him to Wellington Hospital, where emergency surgery saved his life. The immediate threat had been contained. Behind him on the firebreak track, paramedics were working to stabilize the wounded mountain bikers. Karl Kuchenbecker's body remained where he had fallen, awaiting forensic examination. The confrontation had lasted less than 5 minutes from Burton's emergence to his incapacitation. For the officers involved, those minutes would be scrutinized in detail by investigators seeking to determine whether the use of lethal force had been justified. Within days of the shooting, the Independent Police Conduct Authority opened a formal investigation encompassing 2 distinct phases. The first examined the police shooting itself, whether officers had followed protocol, whether the use of firearms was proportionate to the threat, and whether any alternatives existed in those final moments. The second phase proved broader and more consequential. It examined the entire institutional chain from Burton's release to the rampage, assessing probation supervision, parole board decision-making, intelligence sharing between agencies, and the administrative failures that left valid arrest warrants unexecuted. Investigators collected dispatch logs, body-worn camera footage where available, forensic reports, and ballistic analyses of spent cartridges recovered from the scene. They subpoenaed probation department records, parole board minutes, informant reports, and internal memoranda regarding the 1998 escape. The review transformed an isolated violent episode into a systemic institutional inquiry. Families of the victims demanded answers not only about how Burton had killed and wounded on that hillside, but about how he had been free to do so in the first place. The IPCA's final report, published in February 2008, delivered conclusions on both phases of investigation. Regarding the police shooting, the authority found that the armed response by officers was justified. Given the information available at the moment of confrontation, an armed suspect matching the fugitive's description, emerging from a crime scene with weapon raised, the deployment of lethal force complied with operational policy. The officers had issued verbal warnings, attempted to create distance, and fired only when Burton presented an immediate lethal threat. However, the report proved sharply critical of the institutional failures preceding the rampage. It documented how police and probation services had received multiple intelligence alerts regarding Burton's parole breaches, drug associations, and potential for violence. Yet those alerts were never consolidated into an actionable risk management plan. The system lacked clear protocols for high-risk paroles that would trigger immediate recall based on intelligence, short of formal criminal charges. Coordination between agencies had been inadequate. Administrative processing had failed at critical junctures. The authority concluded that while no single failure caused the tragedy, the cumulative effect of systemic weaknesses had created conditions in which a known high-risk offender could escalate toward violence without effective intervention. At trial, Burton pleaded guilty to the murder of Karl Kuchenbecker, 3 counts of attempted murder, aggravated robbery, kidnapping, and multiple firearms offenses. Justice Ronald Young, in sentencing, noted the calculated nature of the rampage and Burton's complete lack of remorse. He received a life sentence with a minimum non-parole period of 26 years for the murder, effectively ensuring he would remain imprisoned until at least 2033. Additional sentences for the attempted murders and other charges ran concurrently, with preventive detention provisions attached to several counts. The legal system had rendered its verdict. But the case did not end with Burton's return to maximum security. In December 2008, less than 2 years after sentencing, Burton attacked another inmate inside prison, stabbing him repeatedly with a sharpened steel implement. The victim survived. Burton received an additional sentence of preventive detention for that attempted murder. The pattern documented in his institutional file, the violence that corrections psychologists had warned about had reasserted itself behind prison walls. The threat had not been eliminated. It had merely been contained. In its public release, the IPCA report recommended significant reforms to New Zealand's parole supervision process. These included enhanced risk assessment protocols for violent offenders, mandatory graduated release through home leave programs before full community reintegration, improved information sharing mechanisms between probation services and police, and real-time warrant logging systems to prevent administrative gaps. The scandal surrounding Burton's release and rampage initiated broad public debate about the parole of high-risk offenders. Media scrutiny intensified. Policy reviews followed. Some reforms were implemented. Questions remained. Informant identities from the pre-rampage intelligence were never disclosed. The specific warnings about Burton's drug dealing and violent associations had existed in the system, but could not be acted upon under existing protocols. Critics argued that even enhanced procedures still depended on subjective assessments and interagency cooperation that might fail again under different circumstances. The case left institutional reforms in its wake, yet systemic vulnerability persisted. In the outcome file of the IPCA's February 2008 report, now part of the public record, the firebreak track between Lower Hutt and Wainuiomata appears in an administrative annex. That stretch of hillside trail, unremarkable to those who pass it today, remains the documented location where institutional failure became irreversible tragedy. Karl Kuchenbecker rode there on a summer afternoon, and the system that should have prevented what followed had already exhausted its opportunities to intervene.